Okay, so now that we've set up the data correctly in SPSS, we can proceed to see whether any of these variables here follow a normal distribution. Now, a normal distribution means that there are no significant outliers in the data, and that therefore a histogram of that data would follow a nice symmetrical bell-shaped curve. And we need to know this because there are two different types of tests that we can perform in order to look for differences or relationships in the data, so to actually answer our research questions. And those two types are parametric and non-parametric statistical tests. Now, parametric statistical tests are usually more powerful, more reliable in terms of the answers that they give us about patterns in the data, but they have to, for us to be able to perform these tests, our data have to conform to specific assumptions. And one of those assumptions is, or parameters in a data, is that it's normally distributed. And so before we can decide what kind of test we can perform on our data, we basically need to find out whether they follow this normal distribution. Now, there are two different types of situations, and you will be given a bit more detail about this further on in the module, in terms of how we organize experimentally our data. Now, one situation is that you have essentially one bit of information about each individual, which is in a sort of categorical independent variable. So you think that this variable would cause changes in something that you've measured in those two different groups. So in this case, you might, for example, be interested to test for differences in height between students who are on the FDSC course and, as they are down here, students on the BSc course. As I said, you'll get a bit more information about this further on in the module, but we call this a case where there are independent samples because we have essentially two completely different groups of subjects that we're comparing a measurement between. Okay, so this student here in the FDSC course is a different one to this student here on the FDSC course, and it's a different student to this one here on the BSc course. Okay. The other situation that we might find is that we're actually, irrespective of this group here, we're interested to look, say, for example, for a relationship between two measurements from the same subject. So, for example, we might want to know if people who score higher on the height here, so people who are taller, also have a higher measurement here in the foot size. So, do people who are taller in body height also have larger feet? Okay, and in this case, we actually look at two bits of information, two variables from the same subjects. Okay, and this is called a paired design. As I said, you'll be given a bit more information about this later on, but there are just slight differences as to how we actually perform our normality tests on these variables. Okay, so first of all, we'll go through an example of how to perform a normality test if you were interested in, let's say, finding a relationship between two related measurements. So, for example, between heights and foot sizes of people, or this could be some sort of measurement which was measured before and after something has happened. Okay, so two bits of information about the same person, irrespective of this grouping variable here that we have on course. So the path to the normality test is the same in each situation. We go through analyze, descriptive statistics, and then explore. And here we basically, if we want to know just the distribution of two bits of information, essentially two dependent variables on the same subjects, then we put them both into the dependent list. Okay. We then go into the plots option here, and we want to tick normality plots with tests, and this will give us our normality test outputs. The other thing that's usually good to get is histograms. We don't have to get this stem and leaf plot, and also we don't really need to get any box plots. Okay. Now you can, in display down here, you can decide whether SPSS should give you the plots. So these are normality tests and our histograms, as well as the descriptive statistics for this data. So means, standard deviations, medians, etc. Or you can just ask it to give you one of them. Okay. In this case, I will just tick plots so that we're only going to see the normality tests. Just to keep the output a bit simpler. But if you have both ticked here, then you will get a nice big table with all the descriptive statistics as well as your normality tests. Okay, and that's it. We just click OK. And then hopefully our results will come up. In this case, here is our test for normality. There are two main tests that look at essentially the same thing for normality, and they compare the data you have observed with a hypothetical data set which is perfectly normally distributed, essentially. In this case, we have done this for two variables, a variable height and a variable foot size. And these are the two tests, essentially the Kolmogorov-Smirnov as well as the Shapiro-Wilk. They do essentially the same thing, but in the kind of data that we are usually dealing with in animal science, where we have relatively small data sets, the Shapiro-Wilk test is regarded as more reliable. So if they should contradict one another, we usually trust the Shapiro-Wilk test, and that way we can basically be more sure that the result that we're getting is actually correct. Okay, so the three things that we're getting for this normality test are a test statistic, right here, a value for degrees of freedom, and then this here is our p-value. Okay, remember the p-value describes the probability of finding these patterns in the data if the null hypothesis was true. And if that p-value is over a specific threshold, and that is usually 5% or 0.05 when it's a proportion, and if that's the case, then we have to accept the null hypothesis. If the p-value is less than that threshold, then we can reject the null hypothesis. Now, in a test for normality, as you would have been explained before, the null hypothesis says that there is no difference between the distribution that we observe in our data and a normal distribution. Or in other words, the null hypothesis in a normality test is the data are normally distributed. Now here we have a p-value which is over 0.05, and that means that we accept that hypothesis, and we can say that our data are in fact normally distributed. And this now means that we would be able to perform a parametric statistical test to actually look for differences or relationships in this data that we are interested in. So for example, we might now be able to use a parametric test to look for a relationship or a correlation between height and foot size of students. Down here, it has basically given us nice histograms as well, and if you look at this and you sort of imagine a smooth line over these bars, then this looks like a nice symmetrical bell-shaped curve. Okay, the same as down here as well for foot size. Again, the histogram looks nice like a bell-shaped curve, so we're happy with that, and we can safely say that these data are normally distributed. So this is how you would do this if you had paired data, so essentially two bits of information, two variables from the same subjects. And I'll just quickly show you how you get exactly the same normality test, but when you're actually interested in looking for differences in one measurement between independent groups. So in this case, completely different group of students here on the FDSC course and on the BSc course. Okay. And as I said, the pathway is essentially the same. We go through Analyze, Descriptive Statistics, Explore. I'm going to remove the foot size here because we can either look at one variable and compare it between two groups, or it can be more groups as well, or we can look at looking for relationships between two related measurements. Looking at two related measurements and comparing that between two groups is statistically possible, but it goes beyond what we would cover in this course here. And therefore, I'm not going to show you that example. So here, for example, we want to know whether height is normally distributed in both the FDSC as well as the BSc courses. Everything else we've set up, we should keep exactly the same, okay? And that's still in here as well. So now we just click Continue. And what it's done now is it's looking at height, and it's looking at the height measurements for students on the FDSC course and on the BSc course, and it looks at whether in each of these groups the data are normally distributed. And as before, if we look at our p-value here for the Shapiro-Wilk output, we find that that p-value is over 0.05, which means we accept the null hypothesis that the data are in fact normally distributed. And now we could run a parametric test that looks for differences in the height of the students between the FDSC and the BSc course to see whether one of them is significantly taller or shorter than the other. Again, we can look at the histograms down here, and they show, again, a nice bell-shaped curve if you imagine a line sort of going over this. In the BSc courses, you can kind of still see it, but because there are a lot less people, you can see here there's only 17 people on the BSc course, whereas on the FDSC we have 101, and therefore this isn't quite as nice, but it still sort of follows that same pattern. Okay, so we're again happy with that, and we would run a parametric statistical test to look for differences in height between these two courses.